You have 24 hours to leave. That was the first thing Heather said to me after the last car pulled away from the cemetery. Not "Are you okay?" Not "Do you need anything?" Just that. The smell of funeral flowers was still hanging in the house when she said it. Lilies mostly. Maggie always hated lilies. Said they smelled like a hospital waiting room. Funny the things you remember. I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing out paper coffee cups from the church reception when Heather walked in behind me. I could hear the heels of her boots on the hardwood before she even opened her mouth. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows. Cold February rain. Tennessee kind. Gray sky that settles into your bones. I turned around slowly. My knees had been bothering me all week from sleeping in hospital chairs. Heather crossed her arms. "You heard me, Ray." I looked at her for a second, honestly thinking grief had scrambled her mind. "Maggie's barely been gone 3 hours," I said. "She was my mother. And she was my wife." That landed harder than she expected. I could see it in her face for a split second. But then she hardened again. The house needs to stay in the family. I glanced toward the hallway where Maggie's coat still hung on the rack by the front door. Blue wool coat. She wore it to church every Sunday in winter. I said, "I am family." Heather laughed once under her breath. "No offense, Ray, but you were somebody Mom took care of. Everybody knows that." That one actually stunned me quiet. Not because it was true, because she believed it. See, Heather thought I was some retired working man her mother dragged through life out of pity. I suppose I understood why. I drove an old Ford pickup, wore faded Carhartt jackets until the elbows thinned out, fixed my own gutters, cut coupons sometimes. I never cared much about appearances. Maggie used to tease me about it. You could walk around with $1 billion in your pocket and still look like you're headed to Home Depot. Truth was, most people who knew me outside work had no idea what I owned. And I liked it that way. After my first wife died back in 2004, I learned real quick what money does to people. Her brother sued me over life insurance before we'd even picked out a headstone. After that mess, I promised myself I'd never live flashy again. So I didn't. Heather leaned against the counter and looked around the kitchen like she was already redecorating it. "I'm trying to be respectful here," she said. "But Mom would have wanted me protected." I almost laughed at that. Protected. For years, Maggie and I had been protecting her. From debt, from bad decisions, from that second divorce that drained her savings dry. Hell, half the furniture in that house had been quietly paid for by me. But Maggie begged me never to throw money in Heather's face. She already feels unstable, she told me once during chemo. If she thinks people only love her because they need her, she'll fall apart. So I stayed quiet. Maybe too quiet. Heather picked up Maggie's coffee mug from the counter, the one with the chipped handle. "You can stay somewhere else tonight," she said. "I'll have the locks changed tomorrow." I stared at that mug in her hand. For a second, I forgot she was talking. I just remembered Maggie sitting on the back porch 3 months earlier, wrapped in a blanket holding that same cup while she watched birds at the feeder. Cancer strips people down slowly, like weather peeling paint off an old barn. By the end, Maggie weighed less than 100 pounds. I took care of her at home almost the whole way through, changed sheets, managed medications, sat awake listening to her breathing, because sometimes I was scared it would stop while I slept. Heather visited when she could. I'll give her that. But caregiving changes you, especially at night. There's no audience for it. No applause. Just exhaustion. I looked at Heather and said quietly, "You really want to do this today?" She looked away first. "That's exactly why I'm doing it today." I didn't argue after that. Didn't have the energy. Truthfully, I think part of me was afraid if I stayed there another hour, I'd completely break apart. So I walked down the hallway to the guest room and packed a small duffel bag. 2 flannel shirts, jeans, toothbrush, blood pressure pills. That was it. When I passed the living room, Heather was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up. The rain got heavier by the time I pulled out of the driveway. I drove north toward Nashville with windshield wipers squeaking every few seconds. Country music played softly through the speakers, but I shut it off after a while. Too much noise in my head already. About 15 miles up Interstate 65, I pulled into a Hampton Inn. Same one Maggie and I used once when a tornado warning knocked out our power. The young girl at the front desk smiled politely and handed me a room key. "You here for business?" "No, ma'am," I said. "Just passing through." That room smelled faintly like bleach and old carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before finally calling Tom Bennett. Tom had been my attorney nearly 20 years. More importantly, he'd been my friend even longer. He answered on the second ring. "How bad is it?" I rubbed my forehead. She threw me out. Silence. Then today, about an hour after the funeral, Tom let out a long breath through his nose. "All right," he said calmly. "Listen to me carefully. The trust is still fully active. Maggie's residency rights ended when she passed. Legally, the property reverts back under your control immediately." I closed my eyes. Part of me hated hearing it said out loud that way. "So final." Tom continued. "Do you want me to secure the property tonight?" I looked over toward the nightstand. My phone screen was still lit up from the last voicemail Maggie ever left me. "Don't forget your blood pressure pills, Raymond." Simple as that. I swallowed hard. "Yes," I said quietly. "Do it." By 8:30 that evening, Tom had contacted the security company tied to the property trust. The house access codes were changed. Account permissions updated. Everything legal, clean, documented. I didn't feel victorious. Mostly just tired. Around 9, my phone buzzed. "Heather." I let it ring twice before answering. "What the hell did you do?" she snapped. In the background, I could hear rain and muffled traffic. "The keypad isn't working." I sat there staring at the motel wallpaper. Then I said the only thing I could think of. "It was never your house, Heather." She went quiet. Not sad quiet. Shocked quiet. And for the first time all day, I realized Maggie had been right. Heather truly had no idea who I was. I didn't sleep much that first night at the Hampton Inn. Every motel has its own sounds. Ice machines humming through thin walls. Elevator doors opening and closing. Somebody upstairs pacing around at 2 in the morning like they're trying to solve a murder. Around 4:30, I gave up pretending and got dressed. Same jeans from the funeral, same boots. I splashed water on my face, shaved with one of those cheap disposable razors from the bathroom counter, and drove into Nashville while it was still dark outside. The city always looks different before sunrise. Quieter, honest somehow. Tom texted me the address of a diner near downtown we'd been going to for years. Small place tucked between an auto parts store and a laundromat. Red vinyl booths, burnt coffee, country station playing low over old ceiling speakers. The kind of place where nobody cares how much money you have. I got there first and slid into our usual booth by the window. Darlene, one of the waitresses, walked over with a coffee pot already in her hand. "Well," she said softly, "I was wondering when I'd see you again." I managed a small smile. "Morning, Darlene. You eating today or just punishing yourself?" "That obvious." "Honey, I've worked here 32 years. I can spot grief from the parking lot." That got the smallest laugh out of me. She poured my coffee and squeezed my shoulder before walking away. 10 minutes later, Tom came in carrying a leather folder under one arm. Tom Bennett looked exactly like every Southern attorney over 60. Gray hair, conservative tie, expensive shoes he pretended weren't expensive. He slid into the booth across from me. "How you holding up?" "I've been better." That's about what I expected. We sat quietly for a moment while rain streaked down the windows outside. Then Tom opened the folder. "I spent half the night cleaning up problems," he said. Meaning Heather's already been moving money around. I frowned. "What kind of money?" "She tried accessing one of Maggie's discretionary accounts yesterday evening. Good thing the trust protections kicked in first." I leaned back slowly. Yesterday evening, while I was sitting in a motel room staring at Maggie's voicemail, Tom pushed a document toward me. "And there's more." Turns out Heather had contacted a realtor nearly 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks. Before Maggie even died. The realtor notes mentioned fast sale potential and estate transition timeline. I read those words 3 times. Jesus Christ, I muttered. Tom nodded grimly. She was planning ahead. I stared out the diner window at the wet parking lot. Part of me wanted to defend her anyway. That's the stupid thing about loving somebody's child for years. Your brain keeps trying to protect them, even when the evidence is sitting right in front of you. Maybe she panicked, I said quietly. Tom gave me a look. Ray. She lost her mother. She was pricing the property before the funeral home even picked out flowers. That one hit hard because it was true. Darlene came by with our breakfast plates, eggs, bacon, toast. She took one look at our faces and wisely walked away without asking questions. I picked at the eggs for a minute before finally saying, Maggie always worried money would change Heather. Tom snorted softly. Sounds like Maggie knew her daughter. I didn't answer, because Maggie had known. About a year into chemo treatments, she and I were sitting on the back porch, watching a thunderstorm roll in across the trees. She looked so thin by then, her wedding ring barely stayed on her finger. Out of nowhere, she said, Promise me something. Depends what it is. If something happens to me, don't let Heather burn her life down chasing money. I remember laughing a little. Maggie, she's almost 40. She's still scared. That was the word Maggie used most about Heather. Scared. Not greedy. Not cruel. Scared. Her biological father disappeared when she was 8 years old. Just vanished one day with a waitress from Murfreesboro and a base boat he still owed payments on. After that, Heather spent most of her life terrified of instability. Every relationship became transactional. Every setback felt like disaster. Money to her meant safety. The problem was, she chased it the way drowning people grab onto floating debris. Desperate and blind. Tom interrupted my thoughts. There's another issue. There's always another issue. Heather's boyfriend. I sighed immediately. Brandon. Yeah, him. Tom pulled out another sheet of paper. Turns out Brandon Pike had more debt than common sense. Credit cards maxed out. Failed side businesses. One ugly lawsuit involving commercial equipment rentals. Apparently, Tom said he's been pushing Heather pretty hard about selling the house. I rubbed my face. That idiot always talks like he's one business deal away from private jets. He's a salesman with an Instagram account. That made me laugh despite myself. First real laugh in days, honestly. Brandon drove a leased BMW he could barely afford and constantly talked about investment opportunities while borrowing money for golf trips. Maggie couldn't stand him. She once whispered to me during Thanksgiving dinner that man uses more hair product than a local news anchor. I nearly choked on sweet tea when she said it. Funny the memories grief drags back up. Around noon, I left the diner and drove aimlessly for a while through Nashville. Didn't want to go back to the motel yet. I ended up at a Home Depot off Charlotte Avenue because I needed, honestly, I don't even remember what I thought I needed. Maybe furnace filters? Maybe batteries. I stood in the plumbing aisle staring at copper fittings for so long, an employee finally walked over. You finding everything all right, sir? I looked at him and realized I had absolutely no idea why I was there. Not a clue. My chest tightened suddenly. The fluorescent lights overhead felt too bright. For a second, I thought I might actually pass out right there between toilet repair kits and pipe insulation. I'm okay, I lied. But I wasn't. Because grief sneaks up on you in stupid places. Not during funerals. During ordinary moments. When your brain suddenly remembers nobody's waiting at home anymore. I left the cart sitting there and walked back outside into the cold air. Sat in my truck with both hands on the steering wheel. Then I played Maggie's voicemail again. Don't forget your blood pressure pills, Raymond. I closed my eyes, and finally cried hard enough I had to pull my hat down over my face in case somebody walked by. Not graceful crying either. Old man crying. The kind that shakes your shoulders. After a while, my phone buzzed again. Text from Ethan, my son. Dad, you all right? I typed back, been better. A minute later he called me. "You eaten anything?" "Some." "That means no." I had eggs. At 6 in the morning doesn't count. I smiled a little despite myself. Ethan got quiet for a second before saying, "Dad, you spent your whole life making yourself smaller so everybody else could feel comfortable." "That's not true." "It is." I didn't answer because deep down I knew exactly what he meant. People underestimated me because I allowed it. Sometimes on purpose. Sometimes because it felt easier. Ethan sighed. "You don't have to let them treat you like you don't matter." After we hung up, I sat there a long time thinking about that. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a Facebook notification. Somebody had tagged me in a post. I opened it. "Heather." Picture of Maggie smiling on the back porch from last summer. Caption read, "Some people show their true colors after a funeral." Hundreds of comments underneath. "Praying for you. Stay strong. Can't believe people can be so heartless." I stared at the screen for nearly a minute, then quietly locked my phone and set it down. Because for the first time since Maggie died, I felt something changing inside me. Not rage. Something colder. Something steadier. The realization that maybe staying quiet all these years hadn't protected anybody after all. 3 days after Maggie's funeral, Heather invited half of Williamson County to what she called a celebration of life dinner. That phrase alone irritated me. Maggie would have hated it. She liked simple things, quiet things. Meatloaf on Sundays, watching birds from the porch swing, old reruns of Frasier with a blanket over her legs, not rented banquet rooms and fake smiling. The dinner was held at a restaurant off Main Street in Franklin, one of those places trying real hard to look upscale without actually being upscale. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling, $40 pork chops. I almost didn't go. Honestly, I should have trusted my instincts and stayed home. But a part of me still believed we could sit down like adults and get through the evening without turning Maggie's memory into a public mess. That was my first mistake. I parked my old truck beside a line of shiny SUVs and sat there for a minute, with the engine running. Rain had finally stopped, but the air still smelled damp. I remember looking at the restaurant windows thinking how tired I was of walking into rooms where everybody already believed some version of the story before I even opened my mouth. Then I turned the truck off and went inside anyway. The hostess smiled politely. "They're in the private room." Of course they were. As soon as I walked in, conversations dipped for about 2 seconds. Not completely silent, just enough. People pretending not to stare. Church folks, neighbors, a couple cousins from Maggie's side, even some people I hadn't seen since before COVID. Heather stood near the center of the room, wearing black, like she was still auditioning for Grieving Daughter of the Year. Brandon stood beside her in one of those tight blue jackets men wear when they want everybody to know they own hair gel. He saw me first. "Well, look who made it," he said loudly. I ignored him. An older woman near the wall touched my arm gently. "Ray," she said softly. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Linda." That was the thing about nights like that. Not everybody was cruel. Most people were just uncomfortable. Heather walked over carrying a wine glass. "You came." Maggie was my wife. Her jaw tightened slightly. Then she forced another smile and turned back toward the room. Everybody sat down for dinner a few minutes later. I ended up near the far end of the table between Maggie's cousin Walter and an elderly woman from church who smelled strongly of lavender perfume. For a little while, things stayed civil. People shared stories about Maggie, how she volunteered at church food drives, how she always remembered birthdays, how she made sweet potato casserole every Thanksgiving, whether anybody asked for it or not. That part actually felt nice. For about 10 minutes, it almost felt normal. Then Brandon opened his mouth. "So Ray," he said across the table, "what's retirement like these days?" I looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" "You know, kicking around the house, fixing stuff. Must be nice." A couple people shifted awkwardly in their seats. I took a sip of iced tea. "I stay busy." "Oh, I bet," he said with a grin. Heather laughed softly beside him. Not loud. Just enough. That hurt more, because it sounded familiar, like they'd had this conversation privately before. Brandon leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, I'd go crazy not working. I need momentum. Deals. Growth, you know." Walter cleared his throat beside me like he wanted to disappear under the table. I said nothing. Over the years, I'd learned silence makes certain people uncomfortable faster than arguments do. Unfortunately, Brandon enjoyed hearing himself too much to notice. "I'm working with some regional logistics people right now," he continued. "Warehouse expansion stuff. Serious money moving through Tennessee these days." That almost made me smile, because I knew exactly which project he was talking about. One of our subcontracting networks outside Murfreesboro. The man had probably spent the last month bragging about connections to a company he didn't realize belonged to me. Heather rested a hand on his arm proudly. "He's doing really well lately." Brandon nodded modestly in the way only arrogant people can. "Trying." Then he looked at me again. "No offense, Ray, but guys our age gotta stay relevant somehow." I heard somebody suck in air quietly across the table. Now, maybe 10 years earlier, I might have exploded right there. But grief changes your relationship with anger. You get tired. Tired enough to recognize when somebody's embarrassing themselves without your help. So instead, I cut a piece of chicken and said calmly, "How long have you been in logistics?" "About a year." "Mister." That was it. Just one little sound. But Walter nearly choked, trying not to laugh into his napkin. The rest of dinner rolled downhill after that. Heather started drinking more wine. Every 20 minutes, the comments got sharper. Small little digs. "How hard is it managing a house by yourself these days, Ray? Mom always worried too much about people." You know how she was. Couldn't say no. That last one finally irritated me enough to answer. "Maggie loved helping people," I said evenly. "That's different." Heather smiled tightly. "Sometimes there's no difference." There it was. The real accusation. The room went quiet again. I looked around the table. Nobody wanted to get involved. That's another thing I've learned about grown adults. Most people won't step into conflict unless fire is literally touching their shoes. Brandon tried smoothing things over with a fake chuckle. "Come on, babe. Let's not fight tonight." But he was enjoying it too much himself. I pushed my plate away. Suddenly I wasn't hungry anymore. As Heather kept talking, my mind drifted somewhere else entirely. I remembered teaching her how to drive when she was 16. She backed Maggie's old Toyota into our mailbox and cried for an hour because she thought her mother would scream. Instead, Maggie laughed so hard she had tears running down her face. Another memory. Heather sitting at our kitchen counter, in braces, complaining about algebra homework while I made pancakes before school. Another one. Her second wedding. Me paying the caterer after her ex-husband's family suddenly forgot half the money they promised. All those years. All those checks quietly written. All those weekends helping her move apartments after relationships collapsed. And somehow I'd become the villain in her story anyway. That realization settled into my chest heavier than anger. Disappointment lasts longer. Eventually dessert came out. Bread pudding. Maggie's favorite. I couldn't even look at it. Around then, an elderly waitress approached our table carrying another tray of drinks. Her walker clipped awkwardly against one of the chair legs. Without thinking, I stood up and helped steady both her and the tray before it tipped over. "Oh goodness," she said breathlessly. "Thank you, honey." "No problem." She smiled warmly at me. Funny thing was, that tiny moment changed the energy at the table more than any argument could have. People notice character in small moments, especially older people. Brandon tried reclaiming attention almost immediately. "So anyway," he said loudly, "once these warehouse contracts close, Heather, and I might finally get that place in Atlanta." Heather nodded eagerly. And there it was. Confirmation. She really had planned on leaving before Maggie was even buried. I suddenly felt very calm. Not happy. Not vindictive. Just clear. Like fog lifting. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. "Tom." I stepped outside to answer. Cold air hit me immediately. Everything all right, I asked. Oh, more than all right, Tom said. Board approved it. Approved what? Annual banquet next week. They want you there in person. I leaned against the brick wall outside the restaurant. Haven't attended one in years. Exactly why they want you back now. I rubbed my jaw quietly. Tom continued. And one more thing. Brandon Pike got invited through a subcontractor vendor table. I closed my eyes and actually laughed. Not loudly. Just one tired laugh into the cold Tennessee night. Because sometimes life sets the stage better than revenge ever could. And inside that restaurant, Heather still had absolutely no idea who she'd been humiliating all evening. The annual Callahan Logistics banquet had been held at the same downtown Nashville hotel for almost 15 years. Funny thing was I'd missed the last 3. First because of COVID. Then because Maggie got sick. After chemo started, business dinners stopped mattering much to me. A company can survive without its founder showing up to shake hands and eat rubber chicken twice a year. A marriage can't. The event was held in one of those old money hotels near Broadway. Polished marble floors, brass railings, valet parking full of black SUVs and German sedans. I almost backed out that evening. Not because I was nervous about Heather. Because I was exhausted. Grief drains energy from places you didn't even know existed. I stood in my lake-colored tie, staring at myself in the hotel bathroom mirror for a long time before leaving the house. Maggie bought that tie for me maybe 10 years earlier. You dress like a recently divorced substitute teacher, she told me at the time. I smiled, remembering it. Then I grabbed my keys and headed downtown. The ballroom looked exactly the same as every corporate banquet in America. Round tables, soft jazz, playing near the stage, bourbon glasses clinking middle-aged executives, pretending not to discuss money while discussing nothing but money. But our company had always stayed more grounded than most. Half the people there started in warehouses or trucking yards before working their way up. That mattered to me. Near the entrance, one of the younger valet attendants looked at my truck and asked carefully, "Sir, are you here for the banquet?" I laughed. "Last time I checked." He turned bright red. "Sorry, sir. You're all right." Inside the lobby, things changed fast. The moment I stepped through the doors, people started noticing. Mr. Callahan. Ray. Good Lord, look who finally came back. Hands everywhere. Pat on the shoulder. Smiles. Real ones. I'd forgotten how much I missed some of those people. Not the corporate side. The human side. A warehouse supervisor named Luis hugged me so hard he nearly cracked my ribs. "You old bastard," he said, grinning. "We thought retirement finally got you." Not yet. Another employee asked how Maggie had been before she passed. That one hurt, but in a good way somehow, because they remembered her too. Maggie used to send handwritten Christmas cards to half the executive staff every year. Nobody asked her to. She just did. I was halfway across the ballroom when I finally spotted Heather and Brandon. And even from 30 feet away, I could tell the exact second confusion hit her face. Heather stood frozen beside a cocktail table in a dark green dress. Brandon looked uncomfortable already, probably because he recognized too many important people greeting me. I watched him straighten his jacket nervously. That almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. Heather started walking toward me slowly. Ray. Before I could answer, our CFO reached me first. "There he is," she said loudly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man finally leaves his cave." A few people laughed. Then she hugged me. "Glad you came. Wouldn't miss it." Heather stopped walking. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head now. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the presentation screens near the stage came alive. Company history slideshow. Photos from early warehouse days. Old freight trucks. Employees. Expansion maps. Then finally, a younger photo of me filled the screens overhead. Ray Callahan, founder and chairman. The entire room applauded. Not wild applause. Respectful applause. The kind earned over decades. I looked toward Heather again. She had gone completely pale. Brandon looked like somebody had hit him in the stomach with a shovel. Honestly, if the situation hadn't been so ugly, it might have been funny. For years, Heather saw me patching fences, unclogging gutters, driving an old pickup. And somehow that translated in her mind to worthless. She walked toward me again faster this time. "What is this?" she asked sharply. People nearby started noticing tension immediately. I kept my voice calm. "It's a banquet." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "This." She gestured wildly around the ballroom. "What is all this?" Before I could answer, Brandon suddenly spoke up. "You own this company." A nearby executive nearly spit out his bourbon hearing that question. I sighed softly. "Yes." Brandon stared at me like I'd transformed into another species. Heather shook her head slowly. "No, Mom would have told me. She asked me not to." "Why?" That question carried more hurt than anger. And for the first time all week, I actually felt sorry for her. Because deep down, this wasn't just humiliation anymore. This was a daughter realizing her mother never fully trusted her with the truth. I answered honestly. "She was trying to protect you." Heather laughed bitterly. "Protect me from what, money?" "No, yourself." That one landed hard. Brandon shifted awkwardly beside her. People nearby had fully stopped pretending not to listen by then. Corporate crowds love drama just as much as church crowds do. They're simply better dressed while enjoying it. Heather's eyes started watering. "All these years," she whispered. "You let me believe. You made assumptions, Heather. You lied to me." I stayed quiet. "There's no difference." I looked at her carefully. Maggie didn't think so. That's when she finally snapped. "You think you're better than everybody because you kept secrets," she said loudly. "You think throwing me out of my mother's house makes you some kind of hero." Several heads turned fully toward us now. Brandon took half a step backward. Coward instinct. I lowered my voice instead of raising it. "That house was never taken from you. She was my mother, and she was my wife." Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over a room all at once. I continued quietly. "I paid for that house. I paid for your college tuition, your braces, your divorce attorney. Half the debt Brandon doesn't even know about." Brandon's head turned sharply toward Heather. "Ah, so he didn't know everything after all. Interesting." Heather looked stunned. I kept going, not angrily now, just tired. "Your mother spent 2 years dying slowly, Heather. And every step of the way, all she worried about was keeping you stable." Tears rolled down Heather's face immediately. "She didn't trust me. She loved you. That's not the same thing." "No," I said softly. "Sometimes it isn't." About then, Tom Bennett appeared beside me, carrying a slim leather folder, like the world's calmest undertaker. Perfect timing. Tom nodded politely toward Heather. "I thought you might need these." Heather looked at the papers. Trust documents, property records, account structures, everything legal, everything clean. Tom spoke gently, almost kindly. "Your mother had lifetime residency protections under the trust, Heather. After her passing, ownership reverted fully to Mr. Callahan." Brandon looked at the documents once and immediately understood where this was headed. And that's when the coward finally revealed himself completely. He stepped backward slowly, then another step. Then suddenly he was gone, just disappeared into the crowd without saying a word. Heather turned in time to catch the back of his jacket slipping through the ballroom doors. I watched the realization hit her. Not just embarrassment, abandonment. Again, same wound, different man. She covered her mouth with one hand and started crying harder. And despite everything, I hated seeing it. Because no matter how ugly things became, part of me still remembered the scared little girl Maggie and I spent years trying to help. Heather looked back at me helplessly. "You let me humiliate myself." I answered honestly. "No, Heather. I let you make your own choices." That one broke her. She sat down suddenly in the nearest chair and buried her face in her hands. Nobody in the ballroom said a word. No cheering. No dramatic gasps, just uncomfortable silence. Finally, I leaned down slightly and said the truest thing I'd said all week. You already had a family. You just couldn't see it. Then I straightened my jacket, nodded once to Tom, and walked toward the stage, while the entire room quietly moved aside. I sold the Franklin house about 4 months later. Not because I needed the money. I just couldn't breathe in there anymore. Every room carried some version of Maggie inside it. The kitchen still smelled faintly like the cinnamon coffee she liked from Kroger. One of her gardening gloves was tucked behind flower pots on the back porch. Her reading glasses stayed on the nightstand for weeks because every time I tried moving them, something in me refused. Grief's strange that way. You can sign legal documents, transfer property titles, handle probate meetings, then completely fall apart over a half-used bottle of hand lotion. The day I finally left the house for good, I stood in the empty living room, listening to the silence. No oxygen machine, no television, no Maggie humming softly while making grocery lists. Just floorboards settling. I locked the front door one last time and handed the keys to the realtor in the driveway. Then I drove northeast toward Old Hickory Lake. The new place wasn't fancy, smaller than the Franklin house by a mile. 1 story. Wood siding. Small dock out back with a pair of cracked plastic chairs the previous owner forgot to haul away. Perfect for me. For the first time in years, life got quiet again. Not lonely quiet. Healing quiet. Most mornings, I'd wake up around 6:30, make black coffee, and sit outside watching fog drift across the water while fishermen eased by in aluminum boats. Sometimes I'd think about Maggie. Sometimes I'd think about nothing at all. Both felt necessary. I started volunteering twice a week at a cancer support center near Hendersonville. Mostly maintenance stuff, fixing shelves, replacing lights, driving patients to appointments if somebody canceled. Nothing dramatic. But after spending 2 years helping Maggie through treatments, hospitals stopped feeling intimidating. One afternoon, a nurse recognized my last name. "You're the logistics guy, right?" I smiled. Mostly I'm the light bulb guy around here. That became a running joke. Truthfully, I liked being useful in small ways again. My relationship with Ethan got stronger too. Same with my daughter Laura. For years I'd buried myself in work and caregiving so deeply I forgot my kids were adults now. They didn't need protecting anymore. They just needed honesty. Laura came out to the lake house one Sunday carrying enough groceries to survive a tornado. "You have absolutely no food in this place," she complained immediately. "I've got sandwich meat. You have mustard and sadness." That sounded exactly like something her mother would have said. I laughed harder than I expected to. Little by little, life softened around the edges. Heather, meanwhile, disappeared for a while after the banquet disaster. At first, there were angry texts. "You embarrassed me. I hope you're happy. Mom would hate what you did." Then eventually those stopped too. A few weeks later came the apology emails. Long ones. The kind written at 2 in the morning when somebody's finally run out of excuses. I didn't answer right away. Not because I wanted revenge. Honestly, revenge had started feeling exhausting by then. People imagine humiliation brings satisfaction. Sometimes it just leaves everybody sad. One evening near the end of summer, my phone rang while I was cleaning catfish at the sink outside. Heather. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "Hi." "Hi, Heather." A long silence sat between us. Finally, she asked, "Would you meet me somewhere?" Part of me wanted to say no. Another part remembered Maggie asking me once, years ago, "Don't let anger become your whole personality, Raymond." So I agreed. We met 3 days later at a Cracker Barrel off Interstate 40. Very glamorous reconciliation location. The place smelled like pancakes, coffee, and old wood polish. Tourists wandered around the gift shop looking at homemade candy and ceramic rooster decorations. Heather was already seated when I walked in. For a second, I barely recognized her. Not physically. Emotionally. She looked tired. Real tired. The kind no makeup fixes. I slid into the booth across from her. "You look healthy," she said quietly. That's the nicest thing anybody's said to me all year. A tiny smile appeared for maybe half a second, then disappeared again. The waitress came over, poured coffee, and left us alone. Heather stared down at her mug for a long time before speaking. Brandon left about 2 days after the banquet. I nodded once. Didn't surprise me. He said I humiliated him. That almost made me laugh. I managed to hold it in. Barely. Heather noticed anyway. I know she said. Trust me. I know how ridiculous that sounds now. Outside the window, trucks rolled steadily along the interstate. People heading somewhere. Always moving. Heather rubbed both hands around her coffee cup. When my dad left when I was little, she began slowly. Mom acted like everything was okay, but I always knew we were close to losing everything. I listened quietly. She used to hide bills in kitchen drawers because she didn't want me seeing them. Heather swallowed hard. I think after that I just started believing money was the only thing keeping people from disappearing. There it was. The fear Maggie always talked about. Not greed exactly. Fear wearing expensive sunglasses pretending to be confidence. Heather looked up at me carefully. When Mom got sick, I panicked. I know. No, I mean really panicked. Brandon kept saying we needed security, stability, a fresh start. Her eyes watered slightly, and I convinced myself you'd be okay because you always seemed okay. That one hit deeper than she realized, because she was right. I had spent most of my life making hardship look manageable. Quiet men do that sometimes. We carry things silently until people assume the weight doesn't exist. Heather wiped her eyes quickly. I'm sorry about the house. I nodded once. I know. And I'm sorry about the funeral. Another nod. She looked confused by my calmness. Probably expected anger. Maybe she deserved anger. But sitting there in that Cracker Barrel listening to plates clatter and old country music drift through ceiling speakers, I mostly just felt tired of carrying bitterness around. It weighed too much. Finally, Heather asked softly, "Do you think Mom was disappointed in me?" I thought about Maggie for a long moment before answering. "No," I said. "I think she worried about you." Heather cried quietly after that. Not dramatic crying. Just honest crying. I let her. After a while, she asked, "Can we start over?" And that was the hardest question of all. Because forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. People confuse those two constantly. I took a sip of coffee before answering carefully. "We can try being honest with each other," I said. "That's probably a better place to start." She nodded slowly, and somehow that felt real enough. When we walked outside afterward, the Tennessee air still carried summer heat, even though September was getting close. Heather hugged me awkwardly before leaving. Not daughter and father close. Not yet. Maybe never fully. But human. And sometimes human is enough. That evening I drove back to the lake house before sunset. I carried my coffee down to the dock and sat listening to cicadas hum through the trees while the water turned gold under the fading light. Maggie's old coffee mug rested beside me. For the first time since the funeral, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It just felt peaceful. If you've ever spent years letting people underestimate you, maybe you understand how heavy that can become. And if there's somebody in your life who quietly shows up for you every day, don't wait too long to appreciate them. Sometimes, the people who love us most are the easiest ones to overlook.